Tonight, you join me in a log cabin while the snow falls outside and the wind howls. Sometimes you might be content to watch the fire, or perhaps a candle. Other times you might gaze out of the window at a cloudless moon while the snow falls. Either way, you're in good company tonight. I have some exceptionally talented narrators here. 20 stories tonight that you haven't heard will be heard. I have handpicked and translated the stories for each narrator to suit their voice. Hope you enjoy it. And I don't often ask, but please remember, if you can, to drop a like, comment, share, subscribe. Let's get started. This happened when I was a student at university. In December, our university always offered a 2-week mountain climbing retreat, and I decided to go. We were hiking, and it happened to snow more than previous years, so a decision was made to take refuge in an emergency shelter. The wind was howling and the snow was unrelenting. The biting cold was too much to bear. When we got to the lodge, we found out that another party was already using it. The teacher said quietly that he found it strange that the others in the lodge were so quiet. It was worse than that, I thought. The atmosphere was downright gloomy and depressing. After dinner, the leader of the other party suddenly stood up and came over to us and struck up a conversation, and the reason for their hushed silence was revealed. There was a blizzard yesterday, and an inexperienced hiker burst into the emergency lodge and collapsed due to fatigue. He seemed exhausted, dehydrated, and malnourished. He took a turn for the worse, perhaps due to the shock and exposure he had suffered. He fell unconscious, and when dawn broke, his breathing had ceased and no one could find his pulse. They said he was dead. They said they had little other choice but to store the body in the closet until the snowstorm outside subsided. They said they removed the floorboards and placed the body on the soil in the closet and then relaid the floorboards over his body. I was horrified with the idea that I would be sharing the same cabin as a corpse, and so dejected that there was nothing I could do to remedy the situation. Chills worse than I felt outside coursed through my body. The lights went out early and we turned in for the night, since we were all eager to leave at first light. I remember falling asleep pretty quickly despite the setting. I guessed that the hike had taken it out of me. I don't know how many hours I had been asleep, but suddenly I was awake. There was this scratching sound. I looked around and saw eyes, lit by the white snow and pale moonlight, looking in my direction. Everyone in that cabin had heard what I had. Everyone's eyes were on the closet. No one said a word. We shared a terrifying silence which was only occasionally broken by that dreadful scratching sound. A moment passed, and then the panic began to creep in. People in their sleeping bags shuffled backwards at speed away from the closet, trying to get their backs to the cabin walls. Someone mumbled, "I can't sleep." And with that, the leader of the other group got to his feet and raced over to the closet. He then threw the door open and stepped inside. We heard him shifting around in there, I guess checking on that poor hiker. Moments later, he walked out with a sober expression and stated, "I don't think anything has changed." It was as if he was saying it for his own benefit, rather than the others in the lodge. He slowly slid the closet door shut with a creak and started back for his sleeping bag. Before he got to his sleeping bag, we heard that same dreadful scratching sound. We watched in horror, some of us through tear-filled eyes, as the door to the closet began to rattle. Near silent gasps filled the lodge. The terror was palpable. The door to the closet looked as if someone was heaving their body weight against it. If you dared to look closely, you could see the door give with the weight behind it, yet we all knew that there was nothing but a body beyond that closet door. Not one of us were able to fall asleep that night. We sat up in horror, waiting for the first light of morning to break. The search and rescue team arrived just after dawn, and we walked with them to the closet. When they opened the door, we saw scratch marks against the inside of it, and all over the floorboards. The body was where it was supposed to be, wrapped in a sleeping bag, in the exact same position.
This happened 10 years ago, in the middle of winter. I found a lump on my larynx that was determined to be a tumour, and was admitted to hospital for roughly a week. It came at an awful point in my life, as I had just moved to the other side of the country, and my family couldn't visit me in hospital easily. Thankfully, I had the support of my girlfriend at the time, but this story has nothing to do with her. In the hospital, I shared a room with 2 other people. My bed was in the corner of the room. It seemed as if this room was used in the past for tuberculosis patients. There were toilets and baths there. Let me just explain a few things which will help the story flow. As you go through the entrance to the room, the first bed on the right hand side belonged to a watermelon farmer. I will call him Mr. Watermelon in this story. On the other side of the room was a guy who snored all the time. He would be known as Mr. Snore. Mr. Snore had a window next to his bed, and I was opposite him. Mr. Watermelon's wife would occasionally bring watermelon to her husband when she visited, and he would share some with me. I never tasted fruit that good. Mr. Snore was annoying because he would just sleep all day, so we had to deal with him snoring. It was my 5th night in hospital when this happened. As usual, Mr. Snore was making his usual noise, making it very difficult for me to sleep. This guy used to sleep from lunchtime right through to the morning. I don't know how he did it. I just couldn't get to sleep that night. Then, suddenly the door to our ward slowly creaked open. It was at the end of the hall. I wondered at the time if this was some sort of night patrol. The strange thing was that the footfall didn't sound like the footsteps of the nurses I had gotten used to. I felt a sense of discomfort. I tried to place the sound by shutting my eyes and trying to focus on it. I guessed that whoever had entered the ward had leather shoes on. They sounded as if they were walking very slowly too. Was this a doctor? I sensed that whoever it was had now entered the room. I looked through the gap in the curtains, expecting to see a hospital employee, but I saw something different. Stood beside Mr. Watermelon's bed was a man leaning over him, face to face while he slept. He loomed over him and glared at him. He was unmoving, frozen like a statue. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was as if he was studying the sleeping watermelon farmer with such scrutiny. He looked to be a middle-aged man, not too different from the everyday office worker you might pass on the street. He was wearing a black suit, white shirt, black tie and black slacks. He looked so ordinary that you might even have sat opposite him on a train journey. He might have sat behind you in the cinema. He might have been in line with you at the convenience store. He was just ordinary. But in this context, things were far from ordinary. His skin was very pale, bone white. Just as I was thinking about that, the man in the suit stood up and slowly walked towards Mr. Snore. He loomed over him, just like he did over Mr. Watermelon. He was inches away from his face. This time I could see the expression on Mr. Snore's face, since he was in the bed opposite me. It looked as if he was having a terrible nightmare. It's hard to describe the changes in the expression on his face. I'll never forget it. Then a chilling thought came to me. Once he got through with the snorer, he might come to my bed next. I started to panic. I reverted back to childhood and I buried my head beneath my covers and screwed my eyes as tightly shut as I could. I cannot explain the fear that washed over me when I saw him pace across the room. It was like some ancient fear I felt deep down in my bones. I know I should have screamed or done something, but it was as if some sort of apex predator was in the room with me. I just wanted to hide from it. I can still hear his shoes shuffling across the room in my mind. He was coming towards me. His footsteps stopped at the side of my bed. He was right beside my head. Even though my eyes were shut, I knew exactly where he was and what he was doing. It was like I was awake in some unrelenting nightmare. His glare felt hot. I saw him through closed eyes. I saw him move his neck from side to side and back and forth. I can't explain how I knew he was doing that, but I knew he was. I don't know how long this carried on for, but there was a point when my hands ached from holding the covers over my head so tightly. Just when I thought of giving in and letting go of them, I heard those eerie footsteps shuffle away. I felt safe enough to peep out and look at the room again, praying that it was just some sort of dream. I was wrong though. The man in the black suit was back at the bedside of Mr. Snore, and this time his gaze was running up and down Mr. Snore's entire body. I watched in silent horror. Then, all of a sudden, the man in the suit turned and left. I watched him leave the room, but I didn't hear his footsteps go back up the hall. It was very unsettling. When the morning came, Mr. Snore had passed away. I think I saw the Grim Reaper that night. He didn't come with a cloak or a scythe. No. He came dressed as the everyday man. It just reminds me of that old saying, the devil's greatest trick was convincing the world he didn't exist. Perhaps that's the same for the Grim Reaper. Be wary of the man in the black suit.
This happened a few years ago, when I was working in a hospital on the wards as a nurse. One of my patients took a turn for the worse and passed away. She was elderly and had terminal cancer, but I really liked her, so it was really difficult to take. I always looked forward to going to her room. She was really warm to the doctors and nurses alike. The other patients got on well with her too. She was a lonely person. She didn't have any visitors. It was a shame. When she passed away, she left a few items behind, and when one of my colleagues was sorting through them, he found a small notebook. He casually flipped through the notebook and found that it was her diary. It was all pretty routine stuff, but sweet in a way. You know, the hospital menu, the TV shows she watched, and so on. Then he noted that us staff members were mentioned. We passed it around and smiled at the words she chose to describe us. No one was mentioned more than I was, and that warmed my heart. Here's a passage. My nurse took me for a walk today. She's always so kind to me. She listens to all my stories, and I really love that about her. The fountain outside looked beautiful. I'm glad she took me there. To be honest, I was moved to the brink of tears. We read on, and when we got to the passage she wrote the day before she passed away, there was a collective shudder shared between us. Up until her final day with us, she'd written in black ink, but she changed to red and blue ink. Her writing became more and more erratic, and smudged. The letters were small and large in random places. The next passage was once again about me. My nurse. I know she doesn't like me, and I don't like her anymore. Hate her, in fact. She's got it in for me, I know she has. She's been pretending to be nice this whole time, but deep down, she's horrible. She makes the injections hurt on purpose. And when I get a bed bath, she does it rough. It feels like I'm being assaulted. I can't stand it. She doesn't know that I know that she changes the medicine that I'm supposed to take. These were absolutely baseless claims. I didn't do anything of the sort. There's nothing more frightening than having a profession that you've worked so hard to make a name in jeopardized for seemingly no reason. I thought that there was nothing more frightening than that, but as it turned out, I was about to be proven wrong. I've tried to forget the next passage, but I haven't been able to. I'll show her tomorrow. When she comes to steal my blood again, I've got a surprise for her. I'll be taking her blood, and I'm aiming for her neck, and I'm pulling horizontally. Just writing this has calmed me down. I don't know how I'm going to get any sleep tonight. I'm too excited. A coworker of mine was shaking almost as much as I was. When I noticed, she tried her best to conceal it and shot me nervous, sympathetic glances. I just remember standing there, silent, for the longest amount of time, just trying to get my head around what had happened and thanking my lucky stars. Then, when I came to my senses, I hurled her notebook in the trash. One of the orderlies found a pair of scissors in her room, hidden in a blind spot. The scissors were between the bed and the wall, just behind her pillow, at arm's reach. The threat to my life was genuine. We were all concerned, deeply concerned. I had no idea that I was so deeply loathed. Even now, as I write this, the hairs on the back of my neck are standing on end.
This happened during the summer. I was in 5th grade of elementary school. We had a pretty busy family home. I lived with my parents, grandparents, and my siblings. Our house was really old, and the worst thing about it was that my room didn't have aircon. It always made summer hard. Winter was freezing in there too. The room next to mine was my parents' room. They had aircon in their room, and if I left my bedroom door open a little, then the cold air would make its way through the corridor into my room. One summer's day, I was playing with some toys in my room, and I felt that my feet were cold. I called out to my mum through the corridor and asked her if she had switched on the aircon. She replied stating that she hadn't. I asked her if she felt as if she was cold. She laughed and told me the house was nowhere near cold. I guessed it was just me who felt a chill in the air. When I think about it now, I should have seen that as a sign. I went to bed as usual that night, but I woke up at around 2 a.m. Next to my bed, on the left-hand side, was a window, and on the right-hand side was the door to the corridor. I couldn't figure out why I had woken up. I didn't need the bathroom or anything. It was just as if my eyes just opened and I was awake. While thinking about this, I looked around me. It was dark, but thanks to the moon, I could see my room and the door. I looked towards the window, and it acted as a kind of mirror. In the reflection of the window, I saw a middle-aged man in the center of my room, peering at me. I could see his face so clearly. As you might expect, I was surprised and frightened. My body felt stiff, and I couldn't move. I couldn't make a sound. I was in such a state of shock. I was helpless. I told myself to calm down. I convinced myself that it could be my father stood there. I don't know why I thought that. I fearfully looked towards the right, towards the corridor where he stood, and as soon as I was able to pull my stare away from the window and towards the door, I realized that no one was there. My mind began to torture me with possibilities. Will my dad die on his way to work? And is he here to visit me for one final goodbye? Was this some sort of disturbing omen of things to come? I looked back towards the window, and the man I thought who was my father was still standing there, staring at me. I felt no fear the second time I saw him in the reflection of the window. I was wondering if I was asleep or not. If it was a dream, then it was the realest one I've ever experienced. I don't know why I suddenly stopped feeling frightened. He was still there, staring at me. I guess that while I was thinking about what it all meant, I fell asleep, because I couldn't remember much after that. The last thing I can remember from that night was staring at his face and wondering. The next morning, I woke up at around 8 a.m. The sun was shining through the window. I jumped out of bed and ran into my parents' room. My dad wasn't there. I ran straight into the living room. My mum and my grandma were in there. They said good morning. I instinctively asked if my dad was alive. They smiled and laughed at me and said that he already left for work. I got really upset and told them about my dream. It was very traumatizing to have those thoughts as an elementary school student. While I was telling them about it, their smiles disappeared and frowns emerged on their faces. They told me to go upstairs and get ready for school, but I wanted to know what caused those looks on their faces. I left the door to the living room open, and I hovered by the stairs to listen in on what they would say next. The man across the street died yesterday. He fell in the reservoir. I knew that man. He kind of looked like my dad. I never had a conversation with him. I had no kind of relationship with him, but I guess I did in the end. I had no idea why he came to see me. I still don't know.
I came home one night from work to see a couple of middle-aged men stood outside my apartment. I was pretty confused and just wanted to go home, so I walked at them and they moved aside. "Can we talk to you for a second?" one of them said. They told me they were plainclothes police officers and showed me some ID. They asked various questions. Do you live here? Does anyone else live with you, etc. After a while, someone from the apartment building arrived. He confirmed that the rooms were rented to single people only, i.e. you cannot have a roommate. The police then told me to go ahead and open the door to my apartment. I did so, and the usual lights were off, so I flipped them on. I said to the police that I didn't have friends over, and I didn't have a girlfriend. It was just me who lived there. The officers followed me into my apartment, and they said that they didn't believe I was alone here because they had been in the area and noticed activity in the apartment, especially in the afternoons. It seemed as if they were waiting for me this whole time just to get into my apartment. After a few moments, a police car turned up, and the neighbors were coming out to see what was happening. It was confusing and embarrassing. They taped off the area around my apartment and asked if I would come down to the station to answer some questions. They said it was voluntary, but it didn't feel like it was voluntary. They took me to an interrogation room and asked me again about a roommate. And the way they were asking me questions made me realize that they were checking me for an alibi. I was so confused, but I knew I had done nothing wrong, so I just answered the questions as best as I could. I repeatedly told them that I didn't have a roommate, but they weren't buying it. They didn't believe a word I said. They had seen when I opened the door that I was alone in there. I didn't understand why they didn't believe me. When I pointed that out, they said I could be renting a room out to someone else. I now understood what was going on. The building management believed that I had been sharing my apartment and maybe collecting rent from someone, and they had called the police to investigate. I told them that my mom occasionally stopped by once a month when I was at work. She would drop off some food, and has done a bit of cleaning now and then. I told them that I had a spare key that I kept with my parents. They immediately asked for their number to call them and bring them down to the station. They lived over an hour away. I couldn't believe that they were doing this. She arrived at the police station, and they began to interrogate her. She told them once a guy showed up there while she was there one afternoon. She described him as suspicious. This was very weird, and I thought that now the police had a description of the guy, they'd let me go home. But they didn't. They wouldn't tell me why I was being held either. I guess they thought I had done something else. Something worse than subsidizing my apartment. I was detained for 3 days, and charged with the possession of drugs and intent to supply. I was completely shocked. I had never touched anything that illegal in my life. During this time, fingerprints were taken in my apartment, and I was told that police found 3 sets of prints that didn't belong to me or my mother. One of the fingerprints belonged to a known drug dealer. I didn't know this guy at all. Apparently, the guy who lived there before me was a shady character, and the apartment was known to the police. He was there on the afternoon that I was detained, and they detained him when he was seen leaving the apartment building. The truth is, a drug dealer used to live in the apartment I now live in. He guessed that when he moved out, the landlord wouldn't change the locks, and he just made a copy of his key. So my apartment was a pickup and drop-off point for drug dealing during the daytime without my knowledge. During that period of my life, I was out of my home more than I was in. If ever the door opened when I was at home during the day and I heard it, I guess I would have just thought it was my mom. It freaks me out that some of those gangsters and drug dealers could have been in my home while I was sleeping in the next room. Those guys are behind bars now, and that's the best place for them. I saw in the newspaper that they had been linked to several dangerous violent crimes too. I had no clue how close I was to danger. All charges against me were dropped, and I was free to go. When I got out, I was informed that I didn't have a job anymore. My company found out about the accusations and they had fired me instantly. Luckily, it was a small company, so I was able to get them in contact with the police, and after a while, everything got straightened out. I managed to get my job back. My coworkers all thought I was in a gang for a while. It really made things hard for me at work. I live pretty peacefully these days, but that was a really rough time. This happened 5 years ago, and I have moved apartments since. But sometimes when I'm on a day off, I see those 2 plainclothes police officers watching me and my new place. After all these years, I guess they still don't believe me. Some people in uniforms can be just as scary as people they keep off the streets. When I think back on the rare occasions I had a weekday off in my old apartment, I would sometimes see weirdos outside my apartment. Sometimes they would ring my doorbell, but I would always ignore it. I understand why they saw them now. I always used to think that living in a haunted house would be worse, but it's nothing compared to that. The only advice I can offer is to make sure your locks are changed when you move into a new place.
This happened about 15 years ago. I was commuting to school with a friend of mine. She was always full of energy in the morning and I could barely shut her up, but that morning she was quiet and pensive. I asked her what was wrong and she told me that she was fine. When I pressed for more information, she caved and told me more. She said that last night she had been out with some of her friends and they had gone to a haunted house. The following is her experience. She went on a drive with several friends. They headed out of town to the outskirts. They had heard of this famous haunted house out in the quiet suburbs. It was called the Yamamoto house. They were all excited to go see the place for themselves. It was kind of a test of courage which was being dared by groups of students at the time. The urban legend dictates that when you go into the abandoned house, there are a few rules to abide by. You have to say, "Forgive me for intruding," as you walk in. When you enter each room, you must state the following: "This is the living room, isn't it?" and "This is the bedroom, isn't it?" etc. She told me that she did everything right according to the legend. The reason they do this is to pay respect to the supposed hateful spirit and allow it to know where you are in its house. One of them even made an audio recording. Apparently, nothing happened in there and no one felt freaked out. Everyone piled back into the car, disappointed, and headed home. On the way, someone decided to play the tape back and listen to what happened. They got to the part where they entered the house, and my friend heard herself say, "Forgive me for intruding," but what came next shocked them all. A male voice spoke as if in response. "Welcome." The voice was quiet, but it was there. When the friends in the car heard that, they began chattering and giggling, yet the tape continued to play, and it arrived at the point where they were leaving, and again she heard herself call out as she was stepping out of the house. "Forgive me for intruding." And yet again, everyone heard the faint voice of a man respond, "Hey, wait." Everyone in the car went berserk again. A moment or two later, my friend's pager went off. That was the height of technology at the time. The page was from her home. Considering the night's events, she was very keen to return the call. The car pulled over at the next available payphone. Her mother picked up the phone. She hurriedly asked her mum if she and her father were okay. They were, so my friend was relieved and asked why her mother was calling her. "Well, it's just that a guy just called asking for you." "Who was it?" she asked, perplexed. "He just said you knew him, some Yamamoto guy." My friend replied to her mother by saying, "I don't know no Yamamoto. Did he say anything else?" "He said to tell you, if you come back, you'll see more next time." I'm sure you're thinking what I'm thinking. As soon as I heard that story, I said, "Come on, that's such a lie." I wanted to check everything from friend's statements to the time she got her page, but her demeanour told me everything. I knew I wasn't being pranked. Something happened to her. It became such a taboo subject between us. I only ever asked once more about that night. "I gotta know, did you ever go back?" "No way," she replied. I always wondered what would happen if she did go back. It made me certain I'd never set foot in there.
This happened 2 years ago, on June 14th in my old apartment. I'll never forget it. I remember coming home from work that night, just really tired. It had been a long day. I went to bed pretty early and slipped into a sound sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night to hear some strange rattling sound. I took a quick glance at my alarm clock and it was around 3:30 in the morning. I'm usually a very sound sleeper. It sounded as if it was coming from the door. I remember one of my first thoughts was, it's way too early for the mailman. I was way too tired and comfortable to get out of my bed to go and find out what it was, though. I had just assumed it was some noise happening in the communal hallway, and I tried my best to ignore it. The problem was the sound didn't stop, and it didn't grow any more distant. It sounded like it was right outside my door. And this got me suspicious. I sat up in bed and faced the direction of the sound. I usually slept with my bedroom door open, and my bedroom faced the direction of the front door. Naturally, my apartment was pitch black, and the first light of the morning hasn't come yet. As my tired eyes slowly grew accustomed to the darkness around me, I stared toward the front door. I saw that the mail slot was moving up and down. I felt shivers race up my spine. I had to go investigate. I didn't want to, but I knew I had to. I crept over to the door, still hearing that rattling sound, and then I saw something that made me speechless. An arm was snaking its way up to the lock from the mail slot. It moved relentlessly to grasp the lock. I was shocked. I just stood there watching this arm bend in directions I thought was impossible in order to reach the lock. The arm was really pale, too. It was so creepy I couldn't move for a moment. The hand was about to land on my door lock. I grabbed the closest thing to me, which was an umbrella, and I just stabbed at that hand as hard as I could. I felt the metal spike of the umbrella connect with the stranger's flesh. The arm slowly and silently withdrew, and I watched it disappear from the mail slot. I immediately put my eye to the peephole and tried to get a look at the would-be intruder, but I couldn't see anyone out there. Whoever it was moved so quickly and silently, I'd guess this wasn't their first attempt at a home invasion. I couldn't get back to sleep after that. And for a moment I wondered if what I had seen was a ghost. All sorts of thoughts whirled around in my head. I laid in bed that night in the dark, shivering and jumping at every noise in the house, praying that whoever that was wasn't coming back. When the morning light came, I was finally able to get back to sleep. I woke up later and had to get ready for my shift. When I approached my door to leave, I noticed something. I saw dents in my door. I guess that was from my whole stabbing with the umbrella attack, but I didn't know why there were so many dents. I thought I had hit the arm and not the door. It was weird. That wasn't the only strange thing. There were muddy footprints right outside, facing my door. The strangest thing was the fact I don't remember it raining that night. I don't know where that person came from, the woods or something. There were only muddy footprints outside my door, none of the others. It had taken me 2 weeks to move out, and those were hard weeks. I was living in fear. The intruder never came back, though. Sometimes I think about that night and wonder if it was something supernatural, but my head says that was a very experienced home invader. Either that or some sort of stalker. I've relived that night in my dreams a few times, and I always wake up expecting to hear the mail slot rattle again. I actually put a cage around mine in my new place, but it still creeps me out. One piece of advice I have is to always keep a weapon near the door. Always make sure your doors are locked, and above all else, trust your intuition.
This happened when I was in high school. The building next door to my family home was a post office. It was weird because the wall that separated our home from the post office was only about a meter high. I used to cut through the post office and climb over the wall on the way home from school sometimes. I'm from the countryside, so the post office was the kind you might expect to see out in the middle of nowhere. People didn't really use it that often. So just to explain the layout of my house at the time, if you go through the front door and go to the left, you'd find my childhood bedroom. This bedroom was separated to the garden by a wall, and our garden faced the post office. The story takes place in July, while I was preparing for a test at high school. During this time, all the clubs and after-school activities were canceled to promote the idea of students studying at home. So, Most days after school, I'd head home and start studying. I hated it since it was really hot most days, and I always cracked the window. My bedroom was fitted with frosted glass, and on the day before the test, I saw someone in black stood outside my window, in our garden. When I first saw that figure, I thought it might be someone here to visit, but the person in black never rang the doorbell or knocked at the door. Eventually, they went away, but I thought it was kind of weird. About a half an hour later, the person in black showed up again. This time, they were pacing back and forth in the garden, and closer to the window. It was really irritating since I study and really needed to pass this test. All I could hear was the person mumbling occasionally and scuffling their feet. I tried my best to ignore whoever was out there. I didn't have time for them. It played on my mind though, and I wondered if they were lost. It began to annoy me so much that I thought about calling out to them. But then I thought against it. I was busy and didn't need to give some weirdos directions. I was thinking, if you want something, then why don't you ring the goddamn doorbell? Just don't loiter, it's annoying. This guy was wandering between my garden and the post office. I got frustrated, so I muttered, "Jeez." My desk was facing my window. I stood up and walked towards the window to see what was going on. When I did, the figure in black just bolted in the direction of the post office. I looked out of the window for a moment and turned to go back to my desk when I heard a faint yet audible sound of screams rising from the post office. Soon alarms rang out, and the screams and shouts grew louder. I opened my window and saw a bunch of people running out of the post office and that figure in black running in the opposite direction. I remember seeing some people clutching parts of their bodies and seeing dark liquid spill onto the sidewalk. The emergency services were quick to the scene. According to what I heard afterwards, it was a robbery gone bad. I knew that guy in the black was behind it. I had to provide a witness statement, and I ended up being behind in my studies for the test. It was a really stressful time for me. According to the guy in black in his statement in court, the reason he was pacing outside my window was because he was unsure which place to try and rob. The post office or my house. I think about this all the time and how lucky I am that he didn't pick my house.
I went to a store in my neighborhood on November the 2nd, 2021, and I bumped into a person who was coming out of the store just as I was heading in. I guess we were both rushing and walking in the same path as one another. We collided in the store's automatic doors. The person who collided into me was literally my exact double. Her face was so similar to mine that had you passed us on the street, then you would have thought of us as twins. There was something slightly different about her face that made us different enough to not be considered identical. She had her hair tied in a ponytail. It was long and brown. I remember exactly what she was wearing. She was wearing a jacket, had a Chanel handbag, Fuji Rock t-shirt, and she was wearing a Louis Vuitton heart pendant. It's pretty weird that I remember all this, right? Well, I own all those items, so it was like I was looking at someone wearing my clothes who also almost looked exactly like me. When I bumped into her, I thought I had collided with my reflection in the automatic doors. Since I bumped into her with the same momentum she bumped into me with. After we bumped into each other, we had a short conversation. The other person said, "Whoa, you look just like me, don't you?" I felt really creeped out by the way she said that. What I considered a light-hearted odd incident had now turned into something slightly frightening. I didn't even want to go into the store after that. My lookalike stood up and began to walk away. I saw that even the scrunchie she was wearing was the exact color of the one I own. This scrunchie was handmade by a friend of mine, who owns a local clothes store, so there's no reason why another person should have the same one as me. When I saw that I had just run home, but I was somehow scared she was in the house, or had access to the house. I guess I sound totally crazy that I didn't want to go to the cops. I don't know what else to do, so I came here and posted this. Sorry, my writing is a bit all over the place. I'm still shaken up by this. Any suggestions?
This happened when I was working in a traditional travel inn. Because I worked in this rural area, the owners offered me a place to stay within it. I took them up on their offer. Life in the inn was, how can I put this kindly, pretty ordinary. There were loads of people living in the inn, as well as the customers. It was a really calm place to live in for the first year and a half. And then, one night, something terrifying happened. I would usually start work at 6:30 in the morning, and that night, I returned home at 10 p.m. Until that night, I had never experienced anything paranormal. I didn't really know what fear was. I was the only one in the dorm that night, so I headed up to the 3rd floor by myself. The second I opened the door, I felt the presence of something. I had only partially opened the door, but for some reason, my feet wouldn't move. I felt as if I were frozen in place. I heard myself call out in a weak voice, "Who's in here?" Of course, no one replied. Something felt very wrong. I tried to divert my thoughts elsewhere, as I was beginning to panic, and thankfully, I was able to get myself together. I was able to go into my room, but I still had an anxious feeling that I wasn't alone. I felt as if I was being watched, not just by one person, but by a group. You know, that feeling when you get up out of your seat in the movie theater, and you feel as if everyone's watching you shuffle out of the aisle and down the stairs? That's what it felt like. I hated the vibe I was getting in my room, but I was incredibly tired. I had another early start the next day. I needed to get some sleep. So, I got ready for bed. I got under the covers and shut my eyes, and within what felt like seconds, I was asleep. Then suddenly I was awake. In a sense, my eyes were open again, but I couldn't move. Was this sleep paralysis? I wondered. It was the most terrifying experience I have ever had. I couldn't move. I couldn't make a sound. I wanted to run. I wanted to call out for help, but I couldn't. I felt like a prisoner in my own body. This was the first time I ever had sleep paralysis, but it wouldn't be the last. My breath became labored, and then it sped up. My chest seemed to be the only part of my body that was able to move. I was hyperventilating and unable to calm myself down, unable to set up or adjust myself to relieve my breathing. I remained in that state until the sun came up. I was in incredible pain. Then, just as mysteriously as it began, it was over, and I was free from the binds of sleep paralysis. I staggered into the bathroom. My face felt strange. I looked at myself in the mirror, and the skin around my eyes was really swollen. It looked as if I had just gone 10 rounds with Mike Tyson, or I'd been rubbing them repeatedly for hours or something. Since that night, things weren't the same. I'd get the horrible feeling that someone was in my room at night. I would regularly have bouts of sleep paralysis. Life was incredibly difficult. I decided to quit my job because living in that inn was killing me. After I left, I was talking with a friend about where I used to work, and they told me about the history in the area. Apparently, not too far from the inn was a huge dam. This dam is famous in the paranormal community. It's supposedly haunted. People have been known to take their lives there. I wonder if my room used to belong to someone who came there before heading to the dam to end things. I can't be sure. All I know is that there's something in that inn which is very hateful and aggressive. There's some sort of residual energy there. The moment I left the inn, the problems all stopped. I'm glad those days are behind me.
Have you ever heard laughter in an empty building late at night? My cousin called me up one night and asked for a favor. Eager to please, I accepted without knowing all that much about the favor. I really regret jumping in blind, and you'll find out why shortly. Look, I know you live close, and I hate to ask, but my wife drove past my new building and there was someone hanging out the front looking pretty weird. Also, some of the neighbors have said that they've heard some noise. I don't think it's anything really, maybe kids, I don't know. Only you and I have the keys, so, could you go and have a look since you live close by, see if anything strange is going on? Call the police if there's been a break-in, etc. This cousin had done many favors for me in the past, so I was eager to help out. He owns the whole building, but the building was empty at the time. There was a room on the third floor which my cousin used as a study, and he let me store some stuff in there too, making it hard for me to say no. I got there at about 11 PM. I figured it would take no more than half an hour to check over the place. I wanted to get it done faster, so I rushed around. I started with the first floor and worked my way up. There were no issues until I got to the third floor. I lit a cigarette in the study on the third floor, and that's when I heard something. I could have sworn it was a little chuckle. I didn't like it. It made my skin crawl. I had checked everywhere, and there should be no one there but me. I decided to get out of there. Quick. Even though the building had 3 floors, there was an elevator, so I ran over and pushed the button for the first floor. I'm a big guy, not in a buff way, and my brain went to autopilot. Because I was rushing and I have fat fingers, I mashed the buttons, and I hit the button for the second floor, as well as the button for the first floor when I got in. I was idly gazing forward at the wall beyond the elevator doors when the doors opened. Usually you can see this faint yellowing white light illuminate that wall. I realized tonight there was something different. A shadow was cast against that wall. Someone was trying to remain out of sight. When I saw that, my body went stiff with fear. The shadow lurched forward into the light. I saw the blank, expressionless face of a woman peering at me. I realized that I might not have been the one who hit the button for the second floor. She looked at me and began to grin inanely. She looked so creepy. Her hair was a mess and her clothes were dirty and tattered. Her skin looked grey, like she had never seen the sun. It looked as if she had been climbing through multiple crawl spaces and attics too. She smiled and then began to laugh as she raised a knife above her head. She started my way and I hit the door's close button. Her laughter grew louder and louder, echoing around the empty building, echoing in my brain. It was horrible. The doors creaked shut, just as she was in arm's reach of them. I saw how much that irritated her. Her smile left momentarily. But as the elevator began to descend, I saw her smile re-emerge, as she looked towards the stairs and ran down them. Would she beat me to the bottom floor? The seconds that passed on my descent felt like hours. My forehead was teeming with sweat. I told myself that as soon as the doors opened, I would make a run for it. I had to. My mind conjured up images of her standing before the elevator doors waiting for me. Or worse still, hiding somewhere unseen, ready to jump out at me and slash at me. The doors to the first floor opened and I ran in. For a big guy, I really moved that day. I didn't see her, but I heard her. She was close. I didn't think she was giving chase, and there was no way I was going to look over my shoulder to verify that. She was just laughing. I didn't know if I locked the entrance doors or not. Her laughter continued to rise behind me. I fumbled for the keys in my pocket and looked over my shoulder. I couldn't see her. I didn't care. I unlocked the door, got out and slammed it shut. I got out. It felt amazing. I drove over to my cousin's place and we called the cops. The cops checked out the building and found nothing but a big smiley face on the second floor, carved into the floorboards. It's still there. We carpeted over it. Couldn't remove it from the wood. It was carved in too deep. What freaks me out is that families live there these days, and no one, including the police, has any idea how she was able to get in and out of that building. I was asked several times if I was certain about what I had seen that night. I am certain, by the way. I know I saw her. And, worse still, I know I heard her. I can still remember that laugh.
It happened when I was coming home from high school. I used to take the train in those days. I would travel with my best friend. We got off at our station as usual, and my friend said that he needed to grab some snacks. I'd already bought some, so I didn't need any. Anyway, I was waiting for him to get his sugar fill. He seemed to be taking longer than usual. I was kind of bored, so I was just glancing around the train platform. My eyes landed on a guy in a business suit who was stood across on the other platform. I was looking at his suit, and I just thought to myself that it was a decent looking suit. One day, I'd like to own one. When his eyes met my gaze, something very disturbing happened. His face changed. It looked as if it melted before my eyes. I thought he looked like a zombie for a second. It wasn't like a burn victim or some sort of deformation. It was as if his face changed in a split second. It just melted. I really wanted to tell my friend about what I'd just seen, but for some reason, something in the pit of my stomach convinced me otherwise. I had this awful feeling, like if I spoke about it, then perhaps something bad would happen to me. It was like it was a forbidden subject. I don't think I could have spoken about it, even if I tried. Anyway, the image of that person in the really nice looking suit is burned into my brain. Especially since I saw some high school girls walk straight past him. And I swear, I saw one of the girls' arms brush against him. Or dare I say, through him. Not one of those girls seemed to know he was there. It's freaked me out for years, and I'm just wondering if anyone else has had a similar experience. Another user posted on an anonymous message board with the following. Well, I've experienced something like that, but it wasn't exactly how you described it. When this guy in a suit saw me looking at him, his face morphed into this weird black hole. I thought that perhaps he had an illness I wasn't aware of, or he'd been in some sort of accident, so I made sure I didn't stare at him. One thing I'm sure of now is that his eyes were not human. I wonder if there are other experiences across the world with these things in suits. Guys, if anyone else has seen anything like this, remember to drop a comment. The next user wrote, again, not the same as the other users, but the guy was wearing a suit. I was waiting for the elevator at the station, and this guy in a suit appeared behind me. Just as quickly as I saw him, he vanished. I remember thinking it was like a soap bubble bursting, gone in a second. Yet another user commented, "You guys have reminded me of something here. I guess this would have happened when I was about 3 years old. It was just before my family were about to move out of our old home. I was on the train with my mother at the time. I was just looking at this woman in a suit who was sat opposite me. Her eyes seemed to suddenly slip down her face. They looked as if they were hanging on by threads. It was the most awful thing I'd ever seen. If it happened today, I wouldn't stare. But since I was a kid, I didn't fully understand the conventions of society. And I kept right on staring at this woman. This is where things get really weird. My mum noticed that I was looking spooked. I guess as she asked me what the matter was. She could see me fixated on something. Due to the way my mother is, if there was someone there with a medical issue or something like that, I know that she would have scolded me for staring. She always told me and my brother off for staring and pointing, and she would remark how rude it was when strangers did it in public. So, that leads me to believe that my mother couldn't see that person in the suit. It seems like people are seeing these suit people in the daytime and in public places. I don't know what I would do if I saw one at night or in an enclosed space.
This happened 30 years ago, but I remember it clear as yesterday. I went on a camping trip with 4 friends. We brought our tents, camping stoves, and other necessities for the trip. As we approached the camping area, we saw an abundance of people. Some were fishing, barbecuing, and playing games. One of the guys in the car said they didn't want to camp near a bunch of people. I agreed. I wanted peace and quiet on the trip. So we continued deeper into the woods to search for a more suitable spot. There was a wooden bridge up ahead, and we felt like it was a good place to park the car. We got out with our rucksacks and walked along the river upstream. We were in the middle of the forest. It was really secluded there, and just what we were looking for. After walking for about 10 minutes, we finally found a decent spot to set up our tents. We set up our tents, put our beers, drinks, and watermelons in the lake to chill, and then we went for a swim in the river. We brought a radio in the hope of listening to some tunes, but couldn't get anything more than a static crackle. I guessed that it was because we were pretty close to the mountains. It was pretty cold that night. Even though I was laying on a blanket, the ground still felt cold. The second night was just as cold. Some of my friends went back to the campsite area to buy blankets. When we were finally warm enough at night, the nights were pretty fun. We were all having a great time. But it was the next night that something strange happened. I had managed to get a radio signal, and I was listening in my tent alone. But then it suddenly cut out. Almost instantly, I heard what I thought was a woman's voice. I listened closely and knew it wasn't the call of a deer or the croak of a frog. After a short while, I was able to figure out what the voice was saying. "Don't camp near the river. Don't camp near the river." It sounded as if it was coming from downstream and approaching our camp area. The voice grew hoarse and raspy. It mumbled and seemed like chanting at points. I really didn't like it. It was really creepy. I could do little else than grab my blankets and hide beneath them. The voice sounded like it was right in front of my tent, and I expected to see a figure lit by the moonlight pass by, but I saw nothing. I only heard that voice telling me not to camp there. I don't know what happened after that, but I must have fallen asleep or passed out because when I woke up, the sun had risen. One of my friends came over to me as soon as I unzipped the tent and told me that they wanted to leave. They said that they didn't want to camp by the river anymore because of something strange they heard last night. It seemed as if they had heard what I had heard. Our 2 other friends were asleep and claimed that they didn't hear the voice, but didn't argue. They said something about sensing some bad vibes that night too. I wonder if someone really came all the way into the woods just to tell us that at night, one friend said. It was odd because if they did want us to leave, then they could have just told us in the daytime. Something didn't add up, so we all agreed to leave. One said, "Look around, guys. There's no one here. We are literally in the middle of nowhere. We had to drive a good 20 minutes from the nearest campsite and walk 10 minutes more. I seriously doubt that someone was passing through. You hear stories of ghosts in the woods and by the mountains. Who knows? Could it have been someone hiking their way through the mountains in the dead of night? It didn't seem logical, but not impossible. I have told members of my family about this strange experience, and I was shocked at my auntie's response when I told about the river I camped next to. That is such a dangerous place to camp. A young woman was swept away in a flash flood, and her body was found miles downstream. I have been skeptical about this incident for years, but whenever I think back to that night, my spine freezes.
My dad ran a real estate company when I was younger. I think this happened when I was in the 1st grade. The economy was really bad back in those days. They were some dark times. I only know about it now because I'm older. But I think it would be wrong to say that I wasn't aware that our family and society were struggling. I remember my dad being angry and upset often. One night, my parents had gone out or were working late. I can't quite remember, but I do remember being home alone often. I was watching TV, and I heard a rattling sound coming from the front door, followed by these horrible, disturbing screams and shouts of what I guessed to be an older woman. I went to take a look, and behind the glass panel in the door, I saw the figure of a woman clutching a knife. She was yelling obscenities about my dad, and occasionally scratching the glass with her knife. She was calling him names I shouldn't have heard at that age, cursing him and blaming him for ruining her life. Then, she promised to murder everyone in our family. I was so glad the door was locked. I often forgot to lock the door back then. That same year, I had read a story about a witch that lived out in the mountains, and that's what I thought she was. I could see that her hair was long and unkempt, and I could see her bloodshot eyes when she pressed her face up against the glass. I guess she was trying to look in. Then she noticed me. "Are you the daughter? Do you know what your father has done?" she screamed at me. I heard myself shout, "Go away." I ran back to the living room and hid there, waiting for it to all be over. I guess you're thinking I should have called someone. Well, it was before the time of cell phones, and I was frightened to call the police. Some kid at my school got in big trouble for a hoax call, so I was nervous to call them. Looking back on it, I know that's exactly what I should have done. After a while, the old lady's screaming subsided, and I felt that the coast was clear. I wiped the sweat from my brow in the bathroom, and after a few minutes, I heard another noise. Remember how I told you how I would often forget to lock the door? Well, I locked the front door that night, but not the back. I crept out of the bathroom and saw the old woman standing in the kitchen. The lights were off, but I knew she was there. I stood there completely frozen in horror, and then I heard her speak. Now I see you up close. You're a cute kid. You made me change my mind tonight, but it's a shame what will happen to you, and your mom, and your dad, she said in a monotone voice. I will never forget the way the moon illuminated her face through the blinds. Her eyes seemed like as if on fire. The knife in her hand glistened as she turned to leave. I found out that lady lost her life savings investing in my father's real estate company. She was there to kill us all that night. I'm not sure, but I think that she didn't go through with it because my parents were out. I've been traumatized by this for years, and I think about it often.
This happened back when I had a newspaper route. There was one house which was a real pain to deliver to. It was at the edge of a thick forest, and I was always frightened that there were things in there. There was a long path which leads up to that house. And not only that, but when you got to the house, it was surrounded by walls on 3 sides. The sea was just beyond that house over the cliff face. I delivered the newspapers really early in the morning too, like 3 a.m., and I was always scared of delivering to that house because it gave off bad vibes, and to be honest, I am scared of the dark. It was one night in August and I was heading towards that house with the newspapers when I saw something that I couldn't believe. There was a small boy playing on one of those walls which surrounded the house. What the hell is he doing out there at this hour? I asked myself. The walls were about 1 meter high, and as I got closer to the house, I noticed that there was light spilling from one window. I guess that kid was bored, got up early, and then came outside to play. I remember the feeling of waking up before anyone in my family and playing games downstairs, and I thought, that kid's a little like me. It was kind of nostalgic. The boy looked like he was in his final year of kindergarten. He was young, and he would jump from one wall to the other where the corners met. It was odd, but with him there, I wasn't as scared of this place in the dark. I mean, he didn't seem scared. I delivered the newspaper like normal and went on my way. The next day he was back again, jumping around in the same place. He was doing the same thing the next day. By the 4th day, I felt as if I should say something. Hey, kid, what are you doing? That's really dangerous. You know you could fall and hurt yourself, right? What do you think your mom or dad would say about this? The boy just looked at me and silently jumped off to the other side of the wall, outside of their family home's ground. I was so shocked that I let out a scream. On the inside of the wall, the drop is only 1 meter, but the outside of the wall was a cliff face. I could hear the size of the waves crashing against the rocks below, and I never saw how far the drop was because I had only seen it in the dark of night. But I guessed it to be at least 10 meters. I couldn't see him down there, and when I looked back at the house, the lights were off. I ran back to tell the boss of the newspaper company. I couldn't think what else to do. but I wasn't prepared for his answer. "What are you doing delivering newspapers to that address? It's not on your route." I told him that it was, and he showed me the route map, and that house was now showing as blank, meaning that they didn't request a newspaper delivery. My boss could see that this had shaken me up, so he told me to go home for the day. Luckily, it wasn't a weekday, and I could go home rather than go to school early. When I got home, I couldn't do anything besides worry about that poor boy, and when the sun came up, I headed back to the house to see if I could find out what happened. I know I should have called the police or an ambulance, but I was young, and I really thought that I might get into trouble. To be honest, I think my boss should have made that call, and I'm surprised he didn't. When I got there, I realized that the house was overgrown with weeds. It never looked like that in the dark. Some of the windows were broken in places too. There was no name on the mailbox, and to be perfectly honest, it looked abandoned. Nothing made sense here. I ran over to the area that I saw the boy jump from, and I was right that the drop below was at least 10 meters, and the waves were lashing on the jagged rocks. There was no place else for the kid to have landed but those rocks. Fear and a sense of sorrow loomed in the pit of my stomach. Then just before I turned away in horror, I noticed something. There was something white down there. It was a bouquet of flowers and one of my newspapers. And even at that age, I understood what had happened. I will never forget that encounter with the paranormal.
This happened after I got married. We had 2 young children at the time, and we have since moved from the house where the story takes place. The place we lived in back in those days was really great. We lived on top of a hill. The house was amazing. We had a pretty big garden too. We lived in a commuter town on the outskirts of a big city. It was the perfect place to raise our 2 young children. We were in love with our house and the location, but on the night after we moved in, something strange happened. That night, despite the moving and all the unpacking, I was unusually wide awake. I hated it because I really wanted to catch up on my sleep. When you have young children, you need all the sleep you can get sometimes, right? I shut my eyes and tried to force myself to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. I was tossing and turning in the bed, but I just couldn't sleep. I guess that this might have been brought on by my nerves about starting a new life in this home. When I checked my phone, I saw that it was past 2 a.m. I was bored of trying to sleep, so I decided to put my earphones in to listen to something on YouTube. I landed on some clips from one of my favorite TV shows. I shut my eyes and tried to relax. My partner was sleeping soundly next to me, snoring. Our kids were in the bed too, and they were of course asleep. I was the only one up. I was just pulling the covers up over my son to make sure he was warm when I heard something. It sounded like footsteps on a hardwood floor. My first thought was, someone is here. Then my mind went completely blank. I have heard people say that they were frozen in horror before, but I never thought I'd experience it myself. If you are the last one awake at home, the sound of unaccounted for footsteps in the dead of night is just about the most chilling sound I can imagine. A second thought came. Is this a break-in? A home invasion? Is there a burglar in my house? Then it was as if a switch had been flipped in my brain. I prepared myself for war. I readied the only weapon I had available, my phone. I heard those footsteps rise up the stairs very slowly. Then my house fell silent.
The room we were all sleeping in was the closest to the stairs on the left. In other words, the owner of those footsteps was right outside the door to the bedroom. I lay there still. I had no idea if whoever was out there had a weapon, but I knew one thing. They assumed I was asleep, and at least I would have the element of surprise if they tried to open the door and come in. I don't know how many minutes passed, but I lay there as still as possible, and whoever was just beyond the door stayed just as still as I did. There was no sound. My partner had stopped snoring, and the whole house was silent. I could hear the sound of my heartbeat. Tension had wrapped its icy fingers around my heart. A long time had passed since I heard the footsteps, so I began to doubt myself. Could I have imagined those footsteps? I waited for 5 minutes to pass, and I didn't hear anything out there. I was sure if there was a thief in my house, I would have heard them leave if they weren't going to come into the bedroom. I needed to find out, so I slowly and silently approached the door and listened. I heard nothing, so I summoned up the courage to slide the door open. For a second, I thought I would see a man stood there in a ski mask, but to my relief, no one was there. I went downstairs to check if the front door was locked, and it was. I couldn't find any open windows or other unlocked doors. It was very strange for me, but I was glad that we weren't being robbed. Over the course of the next couple of weeks and months, I would hear these phantom footsteps climbing the stairs at nighttime. I had no explanation for what was happening, and every time I heard those footsteps, I would go in search of the source of the noise. But I never found anything. Another strange occurrence was the fact that every time I climbed the stairs, I would feel some resistance when I reached a certain step, like my leg was being pulled from behind. I didn't tell anyone in my family about this experience, and one day I came home from work to find my son crying. He said that he was scared of a shadowy person on the stairs. He would refuse to go anywhere near the stairs at night. I am sure that place was haunted, and I am glad we moved away.
This happened when I was in my early 20s, and in those days I was working in a small sales office in my town. One of my hobbies is to travel alone, as I really enjoy my freedom. In addition to the normal national holidays which my company offers, I would also travel on weekdays using my annual leave. People at work would ask me, "Where are you going this time?" And I would always reply something along the lines of, "That's a secret, but you'll find out when I bring in the souvenirs." I always brought back sweets or chocolate from wherever I went. I was never wary of telling people at work where I was going. I just hated the advice that people gave when they'd find out my destination, as I want my own experience. People would say, "This place is good," or "If you're going there, you gotta try this restaurant," and "Make sure you check out this place." I don't want all that, so I preferred to keep my holiday destination a secret. So the day of my holiday arrived and I was on my way, heading northeast on the expressway. Unfortunately, there was heavy traffic that day because of an accident up ahead, so I was really disappointed as it was eating into my holiday. I restlessly looked around to switch into a faster lane, and since I didn't have much else to do, I looked in my side mirrors to see how far the traffic was stretched back behind me. That's when I noticed something in my left-hand mirror, 2 cars behind me. The driver of that car looked a hell of a lot like one of my male co-workers. The reason why I suspected it was him was because he was, shall we say, unique in appearance and attitude. I mean unique in a slightly negative way though. And also, he had a quirky haircut at the time, so he wasn't exactly hard to miss. I managed to get past the accident and felt like I didn't want to catch eyes with the guy. So I tried to keep a distance between our cars, as I felt weird about seeing him going the same way I was. As I kept driving, I thought that I might have been overthinking things or being too self-conscious. But my initial fears were confirmed when I pulled into a rest stop and saw my co-worker's car pull into the same place. I still thought that I could be overreacting, but I found it weird that he'd parked far away from my car. I went to use the restroom, and to ease my own mind, I kept my eye on his car, expecting him to come out of it, but he didn't. When I came back from the bathroom, I glanced towards his car and saw him sat in the same position that he was in when he arrived. It looked as if he'd never left his car. I felt as if there was something up, and in the pit of my stomach I knew when I left the parking area he would too. I could just sense it. I sat in my car for a full 10 minutes, but I didn't see him leave. My car was facing the only exit of the rest area, so I decided to turn in my seat and check very quickly, and there was no doubt. But how could I prove that he was following me? He might have been heading the same way and might have just needed a break when I needed one. I mean, it seemed unlikely, but not impossible. To give him the final shred of the benefit of the doubt, and to satisfy my own curiosity, I decided that when I pulled out of the rest area, I would stop in the hard shoulder and make out that I needed to check that my trunk was closed properly. When I saw him peel out behind me, and I caught a real good glimpse of him, I knew that it was the guy I worked with, and I knew he was waiting for me to leave. I was pleased to see him go ahead of me, and relieved to know that no one in my office knew where I was heading on my trip. About an hour passed when I felt my shoulder blades unclench and I began to relax a little. Then, as if to mock that feeling of security, his car pulled up behind mine, and I began to tremble and felt as if it would never stop. I didn't know what to do. I just wanted to get away. You know that gut feeling that people always tell you to listen to? That was screaming at me at this point, and I needed to take evasive action now. I was in the fast lane of the express highway, and I pulled all the way across to the other lane to peel out at the next exit right at the last second, so he wasn't expecting it. I had booked 3 nights away in 2 locations, but decided to cancel my plans at the first location and go straight to the second. I just felt for sure if he had followed me this far, then he might know where I was headed. But I had to get back on the highway, and I was scared. I sat in my car with the lights out down a dark lane and planned my route. I used the Maps app on my phone to make a route which would completely bypass the highway that I assumed he was still on. To be honest, looking back on it, I should have just gone home. I was looking over my shoulder the whole time, and it wasn't going to exactly be a relaxing break. I didn't see him again though, thankfully. And when I got back to work, I checked the roster to see if he was supposed to be on holiday at the same time I was. I mean, our office wasn't exactly Wall Street. There were just 6 employees, and I'd had to schedule my holiday months in advance to get it authorized. It just didn't add up. But I learned that he was on bereavement leave the same time I was on holiday. It was a really awkward situation to be in, and I wanted to talk to someone at work about this, but I was nervous too, since I was the only female employee. After some careful consideration, I took the plunge and told the director what had happened. And as I kind of expected, the director told me that he couldn't take my eyewitness statement as proof that my co-worker had stalked me. I remember him saying, "What do you want me to do about it? You're a single attractive woman, and this happened off of company property. I don't know what to tell you." In the following weeks and months, I tried my best to find other employment in my little town. We'd had our end-of-year party, and I announced that I was leaving. It was a shame, though, because if it hadn't have been for that creep, I might still be working there. But even though I knew he was following me deep down, I always doubted myself. I thought that it could have been a coincidence, and that I could have been imagining things, for instance. I kept in touch with some of the people from my old workplace, and I would often ask about the company. After the 6 or 7 years since I quit, I ran into someone from those days, and we got to talking. It turned out that the guy who'd followed me all those years ago was now in prison for breaking and entering, and a crime so intimate and violent it shouldn't be mentioned. My blood ran cold when I heard that. And I knew then that my gut feeling saved me that day. I'm so glad I cancelled my trip to the first hotel.
This happened when I was a lot younger. I think I was about 20, and back then, I would often go into the mountains to hunt. By the time night fell, I would set up in a small clearing. I was adding more wood to the fire, and resting at the entrance of my tent was my hunting rifle. I had just reloaded it and cleaned it. I got up to gather some more wood when I heard a noise behind me. I turned around to face the sound, and I saw that my rifle was now missing. A shadowy figure was running towards the trees with something long in its hands. I knew that it must be my rifle. I gave chase, but there was too much distance between us. The shadowy figure slipped into the darkness of the forest. I have no idea why I chased him since he did have a gun, and I did not. The guy was dressed entirely in black, and whatever he was wearing looked like fur. For a moment, I thought that it might even be a human. The way it was running was kind of odd though. It kind of leaned forward, with its arms seeming to be a little long. Whatever it was, it looked like it had lived out here in the mountains. It looked feral and far too big. I had no choice but to run back to my campsite. I felt incredibly uneasy. There were lots of my possessions lying around. He could have taken anything of value, but he didn't. He just took the gun. While I thought about that fact, a chill raced up my spine. I didn't know how much danger I was in at the time, and I was alone in the woods at night. There was a pitch black darkness all around me. Clouds had covered up the moon. There was no way that I was going to be able to sleep that night. I decided to extinguish the campfire. I didn't want to remind this guy of my location. I planned on getting out of the woods as soon as the sun began to rise. I didn't want to be out there walking around in the dark. I grabbed my hatchet, kept it in my hand, and waited for the morning to arrive. Thankfully, the night was uneventful and I was safe. At the first sight of morning, I quickly packed up all of my things and started back down the mountain. While I was heading down through the woods, I heard the explosive sound of splintering wood nearby. I saw a bullet hole in a dry tree trunk just a few inches away from me. I immediately thought about my missing gun and the events of last night. I got my head down low and just ran as fast as I could in a zigzagging motion. Like most people do, I had never had any experience running from a shooter like this, so I just hoped that this would slow them down or make me slightly harder to hit. I guess I was doing my best to imitate the prey I hunt when they run. I could hear the popping sound of my rifle echoing from behind me and the whizzing sounds of bullets flying through the trees. Honestly, I have never been so terrified in my life. Fortunately for me, the shooter wasn't very good at aiming. While running as fast as I could, I counted the number of shots which were coming my way. When it reached the number of bullets that I had loaded into the magazine, I basically collapsed on the forest ground. He should be out of bullets. The tension was unbearable. All I could hear was my own labored breaths. Then I silenced myself as an alarming thought crept into my mind. What if he was reloading? What if he had another weapon? I was exhausted, but I knew I couldn't take any risk. I needed to run again. Just as I was getting to my feet, I heard something heavy land next to me. It was my rifle. I looked at the barrel and it was bent. I just ran and hoped for the best. I managed to make it down the mountain and back to civilization. I haven't been hunting since. I totally fell out of love with it.
This happened around 3 years ago, when I started living alone. I moved into a really nice place. It was a corner apartment on the top floor. I loved it. My balcony was south-facing, and the windows were huge, which made for some awesome views. There was one issue though. The partition between my balcony and next door's. It wasn't very high or wide. There were big gaps between the walls and the partition as well. I could see into next door's balcony, and I guess they'd be able to do the same. Also, it didn't look that safe. Anyone could just break it down or climb it. I guess that the partition had to be like that in case of an emergency. I didn't like it all that much though. The rent was cheap, and the building was old, so I didn't care. Typical for a single man, I suppose. Now, I love all things scary, and I have a vivid imagination, so I would creep myself out imagining someone staring at me through the gaps. I didn't know why my mind did that. It never happened, by the way. The only time I'd ever seen the neighbor was an awkward interaction when we were doing our laundry at the communal laundry machines at the same time. One night, I came back from a night out drinking with my work colleagues and it was quite late. I was really tired and wanted to do nothing but sleep, but I then realized I had no clean clothes for work the next day. It couldn't be helped. I had to get the washing done. I felt like an idiot and a really terrible neighbor, since it was going to make a lot of noise with me going back and forth to the laundry room. When the laundry was done, I went to put out all of it on the clothesline to dry outside. It was a cold night, but there was enough wind to dry my clothes. As I was walking to the balcony door, a thought came creeping back into my mind. Is someone going to be out there, hiding, staring at you? For some reason, I imagined a woman soaked in blood. When I saw her face in my mind's eye, I shuddered. I knew that there would be no one out there, though. How could there be? It was just my imagination, though, right? I stepped out onto the balcony and forced myself to look through the gaps into the partition to put my mind at ease. There was no one there. Relieved, I went about my business, but then stopped in my tracks when I heard something. The sound of something scratching. It was very jaunty in the quiet of the night, especially since my imagination was running away with me. The scratching sound was loud. I wondered if it could perhaps be a hanger in the wind. I listened a little closer and realized it could not be a hanger scraping against something. It didn't sound metallic. It sounded like someone scratching their nails on a piece of wood. A horrible, chilling wind had begun to blow, and despite the cold, I realized I was sweating. I hated that I scared myself. I told myself that it was just my neighbor, and they were just out on the balcony at the same time I was. I then looked for myself through one of the gaps in the partition, and I noticed that their lights were off. The strange scratching sound continued. I was standing there thinking, at the age of 30, I had finally experienced something paranormal. The thought profoundly frightened me. I knew that I would have to turn and pass the gap in the partition to return to my apartment. It was like some horrible test of courage. I turned to go back inside, and I knew the second I turned towards the gap, I would see something. Perhaps that woman. It sounds like I'm making something out of nothing, but there really was something strange out on the balcony at night. The vision of a blood-stained woman leapt to the forefront of my mind again. I hated my imagination. Why was the image so prominent? How long did I stand there frozen, unable to think of anything beside the image? 5, 10 minutes? I couldn't tell you. However long it was long enough for me to realize that the scratching sound had stopped. The balcony was now silent. I felt relieved and I blamed myself for overthinking. I was working myself up over nothing. Perhaps there was no ghost, no neighbor hiding. Maybe it was just an animal, or a gust of wind. I had talked myself down from overreacting, and just as I was mentally telling myself off for watching too many horror films, I heard a large thud against the partition. It was horribly loud. My heart stopped for a moment. Someone was there. They had to be. My intuition was right. My eyes were then fixed at the location of the sound and I couldn't move. I couldn't see anything through the gap. That is when I saw a jet black hand slowly wrap its hand around the outside of the balcony partition, and a head slowly crept around the corner and stared at me. I couldn't see through its hair in the darkness of the night, but it was there. It was horrifying to realize I wasn't alone, after all my suspicions. It was staring at me. It was so horrible. I burst into my room, pulled the door shut and locked it and closed the curtains. I left my apartment and stayed with a friend that night. I don't think I returned to my place for at least a week. Thank goodness for good friends, huh? He even went back to my place to retrieve some things. Even though it felt so real, I still try and tell myself it could have been some sort of hallucination. The horror of having your worst fears confirmed in the dead of night is something I wish upon no one. Or perhaps the hallucination theory is easier and more comforting to believe, or perhaps just makes the incident easier to forget. Days or weeks after that night, I forget which, I went to speak with my neighbor. His son was at university, and he told me that in the past he had complained to the building management. He said it sounded as if people were on his balcony every night. He thought it was someone trying to break in, but he couldn't be sure, as there was never anyone there. It was almost comforting to know that I wasn't alone in my experience. I thought my experience was bad, but the neighbor seemed to have had it worse. Whatever was going on was on their balcony after all. That's as far as my story went. All I can tell you is I left the apartment and haven't lived in an apartment with a balcony since, as these experiences haunt me to this day.
I went on a trip with a woman I had been messaging online. We weren't partners, but I thought maybe we could be. I didn't know all that much about her. It was fun while it lasted, but things weren't going to plan romantically, to be honest. She asked to go for a drive. I was more interested in going to bed, but she didn't feel like going to bed. We were driving around and she spotted something, an abandoned building. It looked like a pretty big hotel. "Oh, let's go check that out," she said. "Are you serious? It's snowing. Now, let's go back to the hotel." Around this time in my life, I was becoming pretty superstitious. I was interested in the paranormal, and I was pretty reluctant to go, yet at the same time quite curious. So with flashlights in hand, I always keep some in the car, we headed towards the ruined hotel. Seeing it crumbled and decaying at night gave me bad vibes. It looked positively eerie. She noticed my apprehension as she gazed back at me while heading into the hotel. I followed and I saw that the first and second floors were in a bad way. The place looked as you would expect an abandoned hotel to look, completely destroyed. This hotel must have been abandoned for years, I thought to myself. This place has got to be haunted. It looked like something out of a movie set. We headed upstairs. There was an old TV covered in dust on the second floor. She wanted us to explore the whole building, it seemed. We headed to the third floor. The snow fell through the gaps in the roof on the stairwell. When we got to the third floor, I noticed that the atmosphere seemed different. It was heavier and more oppressive. I started to hear a ringing in my ears. I think she noticed my discomfort, so we said we would take a quick look around and then head back. "Want to take a photo?" she asked. "No, I just want to get out of here. I really don't like it here," I said. Of course, she didn't listen to me. She took as many photos as she felt like. I even joined in. I guess I was being kind of a chicken before. She wanted something to appear in the photos, like a spirit or something. But all we saw in those photos was the peeling wallpaper, spray paint graffiti, and debris lying around. As soon as I hit flash on the last photo we decided to take, I saw something appear before my eyes in that split second of light. There was a woman's face peering at us from the corner of the room.
Did you see that?
Yeah.
Well, look in the gallery.
We looked, but the photo we took was too dark to see what the naked eye could. That female face wasn't captured. "Let's get out of here," I said.
Yeah, we should, but things are getting interesting.
We got back to the car and headed back to our hotel. On the drive back, I regretted going to that abandoned hotel. I should have trusted my hunch and got out sooner. We got back to our actual hotel without incident. She headed in and went straight up to the front desk and asked about the abandoned hotel. Turns out the locals say it's haunted and has quite the history. Apparently, it's been abandoned for at least 10 years now. It was partially destroyed in a fire and became famous in the town when a woman took her own life in the ruined hotel. It was pretty weird. I still felt that horrible, oppressive atmosphere. It was as if I had never left the hotel. Later, in the hotel room, alone, we got separate rooms, I sat on the bed thinking over what had happened that night, and still feeling pretty uneasy about it. I was thinking of that woman's face, how angry and how hateful it appeared in that split second, how it loomed out of the darkness towards us, and then it was gone in an instant. Just as I was thinking of this, I heard an almighty thud on the window. I looked over at it, and it was slightly open. I knew that I had closed it. It was really cold because it was still snowing out. I had no reason to keep it open. A second or two passed, and there was another bang against the window. I got really freaked out. I stood up to go and close the window. A breeze blew the curtain, and just for a split second, I saw a face appear behind the curtain. I saw that same hateful look I had seen in the abandoned hotel.